Joined in studio by Tash McGill. Morena, Tash. Great to have you with us.
Morena team. It's always a pleasure to be back. And look, it's Monday and it's huge news in politics.
Well, obviously the big weekend too, because we had the political leaders sort of posting many photos of themselves going into the polling booths, being all confidential, like, hey, you can't see who I'm voting for, even though I've written 2 ticks blue down the bottom of the caption. So you do actually know. And obviously I'm voting for myself because why wouldn't I? So yeah, all the political leaders voting for themselves over the weekend, and voting is now open. So if you are ready to vote, you can, although both me and Leanna sort of thought about voting this weekend and then remembered we haven't decided who we're voting for yet. So still got, how long? 2 weeks.
2 weeks. 2 weeks.
Well, I'm sitting on the fence. There's 2 ways I want to vote, but I don't know. Something maybe I need to pray about a bit more.
If you listen to this very segment, it may help you decide, Leanna.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, I'm going to refer to you, Tash, as Taxation Tash this morning, because that is, of course, the topic. Tax this morning. Generally, is it generally like Labour taxes a little bit more than, say, or like the left taxes a little bit more than the right? Would that be a fair assumption?
Yeah, the traditional way of thinking about it is that on the left-hand side, you have a little bit more of this kind of, social leaning. I won't say socialist because I don't want people to get upset, but social leaning type policy that is primarily funded through tax, and it's primarily funded through individual tax. There have been a number of different tax conversations that have happened over the last few years, particularly around things like capital gains, which is obviously where you make any capital gains, they'll tax that too. And then there's also lots of different forms of kind of business tax and what have you. But generally speaking, the more left-leaning a government is, the more increase you're going to see in taxes. Then, of course, on the opposite side of things, you have basically the right-hand side of things, the more capitalist leaning, basically saying that, look, your money is your money, so we're not going to tax you super heavily. We're going to look at the economy to generate revenue and kind of provide for some of those infrastructure services, health services, education that way. So that kind of, everybody agrees, somehow we've got to figure out a way to pay for the services and the infrastructure that a country needs. It's just 2 different approaches as to how you get there most effectively.
And what is kind of an essential service, right? Like, like where you draw the line in terms of healthcare or benefits or things like that. Well, really interesting sort of, I guess, topic, and quite cool because I think there are some distinct positives and negatives from both sides of the spectrum. So we're hearing from people from both sides. Which side are we starting with?
We're going to start by having a chat with our friend Aaron Hendry, and we're going to talk to him about his view, which is a little bit more sort of progressive, liberal leaning when it comes to taxation.
Yeah, when I think about tax, there's, we can be into thinking, how does it benefit me? Is it all about, okay, how is this going to improve my life or decrease my life or whatever that is? But I always, once again, I come back to that question: is how is it going to affect the most marginalized in our society? And as people of faith, I think we have a calling to stand with those on the margins, to stand with those who are, I guess, bearing the brunt of progress and bearing the brunt of economic development. During COVID-19, we have a choice, and we have a question around how do we build back our economy in a way that either continues the status quo, which means, for those of us who are middle class and up, not too much will change for us, or actually how do we include those who are suffering right now because the status quo isn't working? And to, if we're actually serious in this country about addressing some of these great inequalities, we talk about housing, poverty, homelessness, all of these things. The reality is it cannot be done unless we actually re-look at the way we run our tax system, unless we look at the way we actually share wealth.
Aaron Hendry with his thoughts on tax. I like that though, as a Christian as well, thinking about the vulnerable in our country, because all of us in this room here, it's probably not really going to affect us that much, is it? In terms of if tax changes ever so slightly.
Well, I think you make an interesting point that, and Aaron makes that as well, that for the middle class and for the probably, the kind of top earners, is that most things probably won't change depending on whether National gets in or Labour gets in this election. I think most things wouldn't change. So he makes an interesting point about standing with the most marginalised in society. I think for the most part we generally vote for ourselves, but obviously considering the vulnerable is an important part of your voting decision. Now, who are we talking to from the other side of things this morning, Tash?
Okay, so a couple of things that I wanted to highlight just quickly. It is really important to have those ideals, I think. What we need to then push for is what's the approach that we take to get there,
Yeah,
right? And so we're going to speak now to Dietriech Soakai, and he's going to give us a slightly different perspective on where he has landed personally on taxation and where tax might actually dramatically impact his family.
It's such a complex issue around taxation and living in um, the kind of society that's so interconnected. Um, but basically, I'm one of the strong considerations I'm going to be having is more around policies that tax the extremely wealthy. Like I'm kind of the mindset of take more cream from the top and lessen the tax for the middle class. And I think kind of where we're at with taxing for people from more lower socioeconomic backgrounds, I think that's fine. So, but I feel the people who are feeling the squeeze at the moment are more the sort of mid-range peeps. I just feel like that's the most growing part of our population in terms of contributing to the economy. I feel like they could really do. Oh, it's kind of weird. Like we could really do with that because yeah, younger a lot of people in my world, I should say, who are in that position are having lots of kids, and a lot of new businesses are kind of sit in that realm as well. I don't know. It just makes sense to me that the taxes should get relaxed a bit more for people in that strata of society, because then we can, really hopefully make some positive impacts for children. I don't know. It just in my mind, there's like such a huge domino effect in the positive way. If that were to happen.
Dietriech Soakai with his thoughts on tax.
I love that. He's obviously very real and a little bit conflicted about not wanting to benefit one group of people at the expense of another, which I think I appreciate and I think we can all relate to.
Right. Well, and one of the reasons why I think his conversation is so helpful is that it does actually bring the reality of the situation to light. So a lot of the people that we talk about when we talk about the middle class, when we talk about, obviously, Labor has released their tax policy, which includes pretty much no changes for anybody apart from if you're earning over $180,000 a year, then you're going to see a little tax increase on that. Now, when we start to weigh that up, depending on where you live in New Zealand, that actually could be a really significant difference. So, for example, if you, I'll use an experience from my own life. If you work in some sort of advertising or media agency, it's actually not that hard in a semi-senior position to be earning $180,000 a year. But if that's the income that you have and you're living in, say, Auckland or Wellington, a city that has a relatively high cost of living, and you've got, you've got family at home, you've got young kids, or you're trying to pay off student debt, or you're trying to pay a mortgage, that actually could have quite a big impact, because we've got to remember that $180,000 sounds like a lot until you put it next to what the cost of living is. And so I'd like to go back to what Aaron said about we need some more progressive, or we need some more thoughtful ways of thinking about how we can use taxation. I'll wrap on this. Capital gains tax was a big conversation in the last election. It was promised that it was going to go through, and now it hasn't gone through. And I will say this, capital gains tax is probably going to be the dominant conversation for people in my generation and the generations coming below me, because we have to figure out a way of restoring the disparity in a fair and reasonable way between the super wealthy and the middle and lower classes without impacting people's ability to live day to day. I do want to just recap on that very briefly. There's no question that there's nothing wrong with that tax increase, right? Nothing wrong with it. The only problem is that it's not actually going to be enough to make any kind of significant dent.
Right.
And so if you listen to any of the political debates this week, you would have heard the fact that those numbers extrapolated out over a year equal 1 week of the wage subsidy.
Yeah,
So-
Judith
Wow.
Collins kind of yelled that at Jacinda Ardern for about 5 minutes.
There was a bit of yelling, but the math stacks up, right?
Well,
So the question
it is crazy that it only is going to raise $500 million of capital in a year.
yeah.
That doesn't seem like enough.
That's the issue, right? So we need to think about ways that we can get enough taxes in smart ways into the economy to help the government deliver the services that they want to deliver.
My
Very
idea
interesting.
is to for the government to employ people as treasure hunters to go like scuba diving around various wrecks around New Zealand. What do you think about that, Tash?
I think that, are you considering a career change?
Trying to make a job for myself. Now, we've just heard from both ends of the spectrum, conservative and liberal, Aaron Hendry and Dietriech
Soakai.
Soakai. Sorry, I forgot his surname. And by the way, they were the opposite ends of the way that I said that. But anyway, you get the point. You can go back and listen on the podcast if you want to. Now we're going to hear from someone who is middle of the road, right?
Well, it's when we talk to Frank, what we're asking him to offer is basically a bit of a third posture, right? What's something that we should be thinking about as we consider where taxes are going? A couple of things, that I will say as you head to the polls, if you haven't already, as you head to the polls, it bears thinking about and remembering that actually New Zealand, across where we sit in the rest of the world, we're actually pretty moderately taxed. Right? We're not super heavily taxed. So there's some room to move there. We could consider that perhaps we do need to be contributing a little bit more to the coffers. But the most important thing, no matter what, is the posture with which you vote especially when it comes to tax matters. So that's what Frank's going to talk about.
The two extremes are probably encapsulated well into two phrases. Taxes theft is what you'll hear from the libertarians. Taxes love is the phrase you'll hear from the other end of that spectrum. Us Christians probably buy into neither and both to a degree. Tax is not foreign to the Bible. It just has different names. So if you jump into the Old Testament, for instance, the religious authorities were also the civic authorities. That's how the poor were fed by the religious authorities as the civic authorities. So when we talk about things like tithing, which is a buzzword in many Christian circles, that was a tax. And that tax was used for many different things. For society, not just to feed the religious, not just to feed the Levites. And then various kings in the Old Testament would have different levels of taxation for various things as well. And there are a couple of times where revolts happen in the Old Testament because people feel like they're being overburdened by the tax of the kings. But tax is not foreign. It was how society functioned. It's how the poor were fed. Then you get to the New Testament, and Jesus almost takes this completely other approach. So he gets asked directly about tax, and he gets someone to grab a coin, and they go, so whose face is on that? Well, it's Caesar's. Well, then give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and give to God what is God. There's almost like this, I don't really care. That money there has someone else's face on it. You should never be worried about giving that money over to the person whose face is on it, essentially. So the Bible almost takes this, the New Testament almost takes this nonchalant approach to it. But then in the churches, we see a giving going on in order to meet the needs of other church communities. So in our society, in our democracy, that has largely taken on, whether it's recognized or not, Christian values, things like social welfare are a little bit transferred from Scripture. So when I pay my taxes, some of my taxes are being used for things that would go on in the Bible. Then it's just a debate, not whether the taxes should be happening or not, just how much should it be and what do we want it to be used for? That's the debate.
Our political correspondent, and we've been talking about tax. Now, thanks again for popping in, Tash. Really cool to have you in. Someone's idea here, you remember my idea about diving for treasure.
Yes, yeah. I felt we gave that the right amount of consideration.
Well, I still think it's there. It's there if a political party wants to pick it up. If you see it on the Greens website in the coming days, you'll know why.
Right. Yeah.
Someone else says, why don't we levy water bottling plants 10 cents a litre? Not a bad idea.
Look, I think there are a lot of different ideas out there. Why don't we actually tax companies that earn over $50 million worth of profit? We're not doing that either. We could increase those business tax rates. We could introduce capital gains back into the conversation. We could also introduce the death tax, right? Now,
Yeah, so
I'm just
that-
saying, use your money while you're alive, and then once you die, contribute back to society.
Wow.
Well-
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of I've heard that one floating around a little bit as well, but then people are like, well, they'll get you while they're alive, they'll get you once you're gone too, which is kind of funny. Look, there's a lot of ideas floating around, and I guess the main thing is because every political party has a website, and every one of those websites has a tax section, right? And I guess the encouragement is that you go and read that and see which one kind of tickles your fancy or you think is a good idea.
Absolutely. Remember, in life, there are only two things that are certain: death and taxes.
Tash McGill, our political correspondent, always an absolute pleasure to have you in studio. Thanks so much.